Happy Friday, everyone. James Hancock here. I'm back to review the latest episode of Star Trek Discovery, Through the Valley of Shadows. There wasn't really any major news this past week related to Star Trek, apart from a few announcements about some upcoming comics from IDW. But for those of you who follow the Orville, the show will be returning to its usual slot next Thursday, which will put a big smile on my face. Sadly, this latest episode of Discovery only barely managed to do so, with another episode best described as a mixed bag of good and bad. I'll admit that for a brief shining moment, this season did seem to be building some really strong positive momentum around episodes 8 and 9, but now with only 2 episodes to go, it's starting to feel like the show might barely manage to limp or stumble its way to the finish line with some of its dignity intact. Overall, this season is becoming a classic case study of what happens when a franchise indulges in a game of musical chairs behind the scenes with showrunners and writers, resulting in a show without a strong storytelling voice. Whatever story you want to tell it the best way you can, but ultimately I think the story that this season is told, I don't think it's going to be completely satisfying for anyone out there, no matter what their feelings toward Discovery and Star Trek overall might be. This episode featured 2 storylines, one of which involves Klingons, which ordinarily is a major Achilles heel for this show. I've been saying it for 2 years, but the character L'Rell, along with many other Klingons, they have so much makeup and prosthetics on their face that the actor's ability to speak or communicate is completely cut off at the knees. By far one of the worst scenes all season was early on when L'Rell proudly proclaimed to the Klingon Empire that from now on she wanted everyone to call her Mama, so I guess we can consider ourselves fortunate that this episode at least did not return to that terrain. The gist of the storyline is that Discovery needs L'Rell's influence in order for an officer from Discovery to go down to Borth and retrieve a time crystal. We last saw Borth early in the season when Ash Tyler and L'Rell decided to hide their son there with the monks who guard the time crystals. As a result of the time crystal's influence, the past, present, and future can get a little blurry on the surface, and consequently, their son is already full grown. The risk is that if Ash Tyler is discovered to be alive by the Klingon Empire, L'Rell would face the risk of sedition. So Pike offers to go down in Tyler's place in order to try and retrieve a crystal. But as Pike soon learns, if you're going to have a chance of retrieving a crystal, you have to face a vision of your future, one that is potentially very bleak, and accept it in order to complete your quest. For anyone who has seen episodes 11 and 12 of the very first season of Star Trek, aka The Menagerie, they're well aware of how horribly disfigured and handicapped one day Pike will become. And in my opinion, the strongest scene of this episode was watching Anson Mount's performance as he first experiences complete and total horror at what fate has in store for him, but then ultimately accepting that fate in order to remain true to his values of service and self-sacrifice. He returns to Discovery with the crystal in hand and gives it to Jet Reno and Stamets for closer study. And speaking of Stamets, he's still nursing a broken heart and is unable to focus. We see this most clearly in a scene where he's unable to join in on this word game that's intended to show how much the crew likes to bond when they're off duty. But this scene was absolutely painful to watch, primarily because in nearly every episode of The Orville, we see scenes just like this, and that show makes those bonding scenes seem so effortless and so genuine, and also funny. The only thing more awkward than the word game scene was when Jet Reno eventually sat down with Hugh, where she discussed some of her wedding drama. I know they had the best intentions with this scene, but there are so many occasions where this show trips over both its feet as well as its own good intentions, and that scene in particular I think was embarrassing to everyone involved. The long and the short of it, though, was that Reno needs Hugh to cheer up Stamets so that Stamets can focus on his work. But when it comes to thrills and excitement, the main action of this episode features Burnham and Spock in a shuttle in pursuit of a Section 31 ship. When they find it, they discover that the entire crew has been killed by being ejected into the cold vacuum of space, except for an officer named Gant, who Burnham knew when she was serving aboard the Shenzhou. Gant tells him that Control AI seized control over their ship and killed everyone on board. And when Spock and Burnham attempt to regain control over the ship, they realize that Gant is actually infected with the AI, and he immediately attacks Burnham and tries to infect her as well, and that Control AI now perceives Burnham to be the biggest obstacle to its plans. I have to say that there were some details about the scene that kind of bugged me. First of all, Control AI had no way of knowing that anyone would come to investigate that ship, much less that it would be Burnham itself, so the idea of it just sitting out there in space pretending to be dead with the other corpses strained my suspension of disbelief to the breaking point. But what really annoyed me was how in combat, Control AI suddenly decided to turn into the T-3000 from Terminator Genisys, one of the worst movies ever made, and just like in that movie, they stop it with magnetism. Borrow from any science fiction movies and shows you like, but let's all agree to let Terminator Genisys just die and be forgotten for the sake of all humanity. In any event, the episode draws to a close with Discovery facing off against 30 Section 31 ships, all of which appear to be taken over by the Control AI. Burnham suggests abandoning and destroying Discovery in order to protect the Sphere data, an idea that Pike agrees with before reaching out to Enterprise for aid. It was actually a fairly decent dramatic cliffhanger, and the thing that really made me breathe a sigh of relief was that the show so far has not tried to link Control with the origins of the Borg. Everyone keeps talking about it, but so far the show has not made an explicit connection. I feel like this show has already wreaked havoc on enough cool Star Trek lore, and I hope this show will have the good taste to leave the Borg alone. But with the time crystal in their possession and the Discovery about to be destroyed, it's starting to become a little bit more clear how this show, in its own feeble way, is at least trying to find a way to potentially match up with Star Trek continuity before the season's end. There'll be plenty of holes in what they come up with, and there'll be plenty of loose ends, but I've made it this far, so I'll be sticking with it to the end. But I have to admit that with only 2 episodes left, it's hard for me to envision a scenario where this show suddenly finds a way to completely redeem itself before it draws to a close. At any rate, I think that's all I got to say on this particular episode. It's kind of a big movie weekend. You have 2 options. You got superheroes with Shazam, or you got horror with Pet Sematary. I've reviewed both of them on this channel. I don't think either film is a complete home run, but depending upon what kind of movies you're into, pick your poison. But if you enjoyed this reaction or review, please consider subscribing to my channel. I would really appreciate it. If you want to talk more about Star Trek or Pet Sematary or Shazam or whatever, you can always find me on Twitter at Colbrax, and there's a link in the description below. But I hope everyone has an absolutely amazing weekend. Thanks so much for the support on this channel, but more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.